Welcome to today's presentation. Today's subject is the future is local. Communities that don't talk together don't last together. The future of local communities is shaped by today's local choices. And I think today in our news, we're seeing even more of those factors come into play. This webinar will explore how decisions made now influence tomorrow, why local voices really truly do matter, how creating places people value keeps people connected, why long-term planning outlasts quick fixes, and that's for sure, and why collaboration across councils, groups and residents secures stronger futures. Today's presenter is Linda Ford, OAM. This is the final in our Stronger Communities webinar series, and we hope you've gained a lot and shared the knowledge that you've learned with others through our videos. So let me introduce Linda. For 37 years, she's worked across Queensland, South Australia and Victoria in government, business and community services, always integrating cultural diversity into her work. Nearly 20 of those years were spent in Logan City in Queensland, where intercultural practice became central to everything she designed, delivered and advised on. For more than 25 years, she's actively applied interculturalism, the intentional bringing together of people from different cultures, faith and language backgrounds. In 2007, she discovered that this was a natural way for working had a name, that this natural way had a working name. And since 2013, she's consistently advocated for all levels of government to adopt intercultural approach to policy and strategy. Her contributions have been widely recognised. She received the Centenary of Federation Medal for services to multiculturalism in Queensland and was named an intercultural expert by the Council of Europe in 2016, one of only 3 outside Europe. And in 2021, she was awarded with one of Australia's highest orders, the OAM, for her services to multiculturalism in Victoria. Linda, welcome to today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Charles. Great to see you. And thanks everyone for coming along. I'll just share my screen and hope that this works perfectly. Is that working perfectly, Charles?
I can see it beautifully.
Fabulous. Okay. So everyone, as Charles said, this is our last session today, last of 3 webinar sessions. We've gone through really from the macro at the beginning around interculturalism, then we've moved into incivility, and now really what we're going to be focusing on today is about communities talking with each other and the kinds of conversations that we want them to be having, but also the facilitation role that council and other key leaders in communities, neighbourhood houses, service clubs, schools, for example, can assist with in terms of in terms of facilitating those conversations. And then finally, how you can go about doing that, the kind of ways that you'll be able, that you could be thinking about in order to be able to facilitate those conversations. Sorry, I think there's just a little bit of a delay. There we go. So really, we're going to be talking today about how our communities are shaped by the way that we talk to each other, and then how we can go about doing that, and some examples of what can be done, as I said. And really, what we're trying to do is to move from the macro to the micro. As you know, people who have been to my previous webinars know that I always start with a question. And in the chat box, what I'd like you to do is to put a number from 1 to 10 about what your community or neighbourhood or council area should be thinking about, or what is the level of interaction that they're having at this particular moment in time. And we want you to be thinking about people within your communities who are not like each other in some significant way. So it could be that they have a disability, and is there interaction between people with disability and non-people, when people with non-disability? Is it around culture? Is it around income level, that kind of thing? So something that significantly separates people, and what level of interaction do you think that there is at the moment in your community?
Good 5s, 6s and 7s are good numbers.
Yep. Great. Okay, that's really good. Excellent. All right, thank you. So as I said before, and Charles said before, The title of this webinar is The Future of Local, sorry, the future of is local. Communities that don't talk together don't last together. And it's not a slogan, it's a warning and an invitation that if we ignore voices and decision-making becomes siloed, then feelings of belonging and community cohesion aren't achievable. Because what happens is that cracks appear and social fragmentation then follows. But it's also an invitation for us to think about how we can strengthen social cohesion through intercultural dialogue. And I'm not talking about just consultation within your communities, but actually talking and thinking between each other about difference and about how we can bring together difference so that over time people create relationships with each other in really positive ways. So you're going to be hearing me. Sorry, you're going to be hearing me today talking about interculturalism, and I'm really sorry to those people who have heard this before, but I think we need to have this basis of understanding of these different terms before we start. So what's interculturalism? And it really is about the policy and practice of intentionally bringing together people from a range of different backgrounds, people who are different to each other in some way that's important enough to create potential conflict. And what we want to do is to meaningfully create interaction between them. So we want them to be talking, we want them to not have to deal with the elephant in the room if there's questions that they have of each other, that there's a goodwill about having those sorts of conversations and asking those sorts of questions. And what we want these conversations or interculturalism to result in is reduced fear in your community of the other. And again, that could be people with disability, the other. It could be people who are unemployed and on Centrelink benefits. It could be people from different cultural or faith backgrounds. So we want to be reducing that fear. We also want to be enhancing human rights and building that social inclusion and strengthening community resilience and cohesion, because we know when there are threats to that, we need to have really good, trusting, strong relationships in order to be able to counteract whatever those particular threats are to our communities. And that could be, a natural disaster. It could be many different things. So what's interculturalism? And this is a very busy slide. It's meant to be. The reason it's busy is because we're trying to create as many connections as possible. The prefix inter means within and between. So partly it's about bringing together First Nations peoples with people born in Australia, for example, and people born overseas. But because interculturalism is about intersections, it's also about understanding that people, when they're standing in front of you, are not just their ethnicity. They're not just about the geography of where they were born or their faith. They're also about whether they are gay, whether they're young, whether they're an older person, whether they have a disability, whether they're a parent, whether they're still at school, whether they're on unemployment benefits or earn $200,000 a year. So it's very much about bringing together people to do that relationship building between them and understanding that we are all multidimensional and we're not just, I'm not just born in Brisbane and now living in Melbourne. I'm a whole lot of other things. One of the issues with interculturalism is that it's often difficult for people to feel comfortable with doing that because they're, often a little bit concerned that they might inflame situations or that there might be things that come up that they actually can't handle. So there's a bit of a skill set in it, but it doesn't have to be really scary because, again, if we're constantly trying to build community, we get people who are happy to give each other a bit of a break. We're not always going to get it right, but as long as there's goodwill there, we will be able to move ahead as an intercultural community. Multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is the society that we live in. It's how we have always been built. First Nations people were a multicultural society. And Australia is one of the most multicultural societies in the world. So we have 51.5% of Australians were either born overseas or have one parent born overseas, which is a huge, group of people over the last, probably 20 or 30 years, for example. The cultural diversity just in my generation has been extraordinary. And I think the way that we are coping with multiculturalism in Australia has always been exemplary. My concern now are the kinds of words that I'm hearing in academic circles, in practitioner circles, in local government, and with government MPs, for example, and I don't mean the populists who stand to gain from these words, but things like fragmentation or cracks in multiculturalism, fraying, those kinds of words and issues that we're having, I think we need to be looking at addressing in some way that's meaningful. And one of the ways that we can do this is through interculturalism. So multiculturalism can have the unintended consequence of people keeping people apart. And I always use the example of something like a planned activity group in aged care, for example, that a council might run, that we might have Croatian older people on Mondays, and we might have Greek older people on Tuesdays and Somalian on Wednesdays. And while all of that's fine, and often, you know, the issue between people is around language, it's often not written into programs, into these planned activity groups, about bringing people together maybe once or twice a year, encouraging or bringing in some translators, some interpreters, so that they can have a common language through each other. And they could be talking about their grandchildren or about their food, whatever it is. But what we want by the end of that day is for those older people to walk away thinking, oh, I met a very nice Somalian grandmother today, or I met a very nice Greek grandfather today, and he showed me photos of his children. So we want those kinds of interactions to happen, because we also want social cohesion to be happening at every single level of Australian society. We don't want it simply to be that we're talking about joining young people or adults, for example. We also want seniors to feel more connected to their communities, and we want them to feel safer. And one of the ways of doing that is to provide that intercultural facilitation rather than a multicultural approach to the way that we run our services. So we're also going to be talking today about intercultural dialogue, and really that's the basis of this webinar today. And it's the respectful, open exchange of ideas and experiences, as I was saying before, to get perspectives between groups of people who are different to each other in some way. And the purpose is to build understanding, to reduce prejudice, which is really important, and create shared solutions by recognising both common ground and cultural differences. So again, we're not saying step away from whoever it is that makes you you, step away from your faith, step away from your country of origin, step away from your culture. We're not saying any of that. We're saying bring all of that with you, and then let's exchange views, let's exchange understanding of each other, and make sure that when we leave each other, we've had a positive experience, we've shared a laugh together, shared some joy, hopefully, some stories, and that we've created a common positive experience that will help us further down the track. So when dialogue, intercultural dialogue is missing, we can see that, I think, these days. I don't know about you, but certainly I'm seeing that people are retreating into their smaller groups. They're finding people who are like them, for better or worse. The social cohesion, either at that neighbourhood or regional or larger Australian level, weakens. Social fragmentation starts to grow. And again, if there's no intervention in that, then simply the fragmentation gets bigger. Rumours fill the gaps that are within these conversations, and then those questions about us and them, they get something that we don't get. That sort of conversation starts to creep in. And I think that there's at least 4 clear signs that that the dialogue that's missing can actually lead to 4 different that can lead to 4 different issues for us. So one of them is that around without having genuine dialogue, we're going to have misunderstandings. And rather than giving each other a bit of a break, what we're going to be doing is having mistrust and ill will again creeping into these conversations. We're going to see small issues escalating quickly in communities, and I think we've also seen that in some areas, certainly in about 4 different local governments in Victoria, in Greater Melbourne area. That's been an issue recently, not just about misunderstandings, but small issues being escalated to become public issues, and that makes it much more difficult to deal with. Then we've got issues around communities becoming siloed. And again, that's not just cultural groups, it can be, but it's very much about people staying in their own circles, and then feeling afraid, and that trust reducing between different communities. And then also that decisions that are made by councils, for example, are feeling like they're unfair. So it's difficult for councils sometimes to explain why a particular suburb or group of people get something that other people don't. And part of that is about the reflection of diversity, but part of it is about leadership and leaders being concerned about having to explain that. And so they either become risk averse, or if they do explain it, then they can do that in a way that people start to understand why a community needs a certain thing and others don't. So really the challenge at this point, and also the opportunities for councils and communities to approach problem solving using an intercultural lens. And when we do that, and I'll use an example a little bit later on, we stop managing the differences between us and we start learning from them. And it's that learning that then becomes a really solid foundation for for the kind of community that we individually and as groups want to live in. Last time, you might remember that the webinar in this series was around incivility. And we all agreed that incivility had increased quite substantially over the last 5 years. We've all felt it, and many of us have experienced it in some way or another. So I think that we actually set the tone of our community by the choices that we make and the conversations that we start or that we want to avoid, and the way that we treat each other every single day. I think it's about the shopkeeper and the medical receptionist and the McDonald's counter staff. And, one of my nephews who's nearly 21 works in Brisbane at an RSL. Oh, actually, sorry, no, a service, a football club. And he is abused all the time, although members have to use their card to actually get in so they can identify who's been abusing him. And he's 21. I just wonder how you look at a 21-year-old and decide that you're going to yell at him because of your food. And so, that starts to make people vulnerable to the mood that we're in and to our impatience and our sense of entitlement. And they're the kinds of things that make him decide whether or not he actually wants to go to work. So I can't imagine what it would be like working in a place as a young person where you don't know the name of the people who have been abusing you, and yet you're kind of expecting it all the time. So I think that the way also, and we've talked about this before, how our institutions treat our most vulnerable people, people with English as a recent language, children, young people, people with disability, older people, all of that impacts their experience of being in the broader world. And part of the conversation that I'm wanting to have today is that it's as basic as that kind of discussion between people. I'm really feeling put upon by adults in this society who are choosing to yell at me because I'm not moving fast enough with their food, or the kitchen's not moving fast enough with their food. And so this isn't just about consultations or meetings, it's broader than that. Now, one of the aspects of intercultural dialogue, as I said before, is that it helps us to understand how people experience a sense of belonging and fairness and connection in their communities. And when that intercultural dialogue is present, I think that we actually feel it. Because what we see are more people will be volunteering. We see small businesses collaborating, and my community here is known, the traders here are known very well for putting on things like Halloween and Easter, Easter bunnies around the place, and children, trick-or-treating into shops. And so there's that, not just that collaboration of small business, but that they become part of the community and part of the experience that children have of living in this particular community. Schools and pubs cross-pollinate, street corners feel friendlier, and this is the kind of thing that you can see in social cohesion every single day. But if the bins don't get collected and if a playground is closed or there's some kind of, problems with roads, then people start to talk and they talk to their council or their local neighbourhood house. They talk to each other, start to complain to each other. And they also talk, with each other about the things that are going well in a community. So clearly that's what we're trying to achieve. It shifts our focus, I think, intercultural dialogue from managing difference, and often recently we can become really defensive about that. So, sometimes what makes us different is actually what keeps us apart. And that defensiveness becomes something then that, as I said before, some people are starting to retreat into who they know and who reflects their own values without actually opening themselves up to difference and to hearing from different people. So I think one of the aspects of this is about keeping ourselves curious and understanding that we always want people whose views are different from ours. In order to have these conversations, I think there's 3 anchors to this, and I'm particularly sort of focusing this at the moment on local governments because local government officers and elected members are the ones who are most likely able to influence people's lives on a daily basis. And we know that. So the first one is around place, that streetscapes and parks and libraries and markets and sporting spaces all leave legacies to communities. And part of that is about what does it feel like to live there and what impact can I have on where I live and the way that something looks or how I use it. Who's asking me those sorts of questions? And how can we go about having the opportunity to work with the council on designing that? Co-designing, it's always a good word, but it actually does mean something, which is about, getting out the big pieces of paper, getting an idea of what people want, but I think more importantly actually about just hanging around where people are and talking to them in that kind of way. And it might be that you start to facilitate small group conversations without a table in the middle of you, just within that park or within that space, that traders area, for example, that you're wanting to improve. It's not all happy families, of course, because, just because you talk with someone doesn't mean that you're going to like them or other people are going to like each other. But it is really about having and making an effort, I think, about hearing each other out. And if we don't do that and we're not role modeling that, then we're not going to find other people are prepared to do it either. So I think that that the conversations that we have, setting that tone, as I said before, is critical. The second thing is around belonging as a practice. I've worked in 2 local governments, I've worked in community services for many, many years, and we always like a good program. But in fact, belonging is an ongoing kind of opportunity for councils and community centres and service clubs to connect with people and maintain relationships with them. We've got something going on in my community at the moment. And so Monday night, there was a consultation about the removal of level crossings. And I live in this tiny little, called a village, but it's inner city Melbourne. And our roads are so tiny that you can have 1 car on each side with 1 car driving up the middle. So it's a very small streetscape. And there's a train line. And so at the moment, we have to cross the train line in order to get to the other side of the village. The state government wants to remove that level crossing, which then becomes, well, what are they going to do? Because it's not as though we can have some, really big underpass, whatever it is. So there's some consultations that are happening at the moment, and it literally took me days to find out when and where the consultations were being held because the website didn't have a link. There's no posters around the village. There was a QR code that it was on a flyer in our letterbox that was in English only, and we have a very large population of older Greek, Italian and Maltese migrants. And so because that was in English and Macedonian migrants as well. And so because that was in English only, my neighbours didn't even know that it was happening. So I thought, well, if I can't find out how to be involved in all of this, then who can find it out? And I just kept going and going, and I followed this really complex trail. I worked it out. And I went along, and not surprisingly, but very sadly, my husband and I were the only community members who were present. There were 6 staff, 3 community engagement people, an urban planner, a road engineer, and their supervisor, and us. And really, that's kind of ticking a box that says, yes, the consultation's been undertaken, but there was no opportunity for innovation, no opportunity for co-creation, and no opportunity for really any kind of design that might be useful for our community. The third is around moving from looking at practice from projects to behaviours. And again, I think that when we create this ongoing engagement and inclusion, then what we get are people continuing to talk to each other after the project ends. And that's really what we're needing to talk about, is how do we keep this conversation ongoing? Because there are going to be times when we need that. And sometimes it's too late to start the conversation. It should have been in place for a long time before that. I'm keen to find out, what are the conversations that you think that your communities need to be having now, and whether or not they are having those conversations. So I'll just move that one over. What are the 3 major issues that people need to be talking about? It doesn't matter how contentious those conversations might be. Don't worry about writing it in the chat box. I just want you to think about it for a second. And then the question becomes, well, how are you going to do that? Is there one of those 3 major issues that you're wanting to create community connection around, and that you have within your ability to do that? There's what I call 5 foundations of connection, and it's certainly one of the 5 of the principles that I use in the kind of work that I do. We've looked already at why intercultural dialogue matters, and why we can't take social cohesion for granted, why the choices that we individually and collectively make influence the degree of belonging that people feel. And this is all very nice, but what does it actually look like in practice? And again, one of the things that we're talking about is belonging, and saying to people, you belong here. We don't want to be saying, look, this place runs fine without you. It's, come along, whatever, we don't really care. We actually want council to be saying, and service clubs and others to be saying, you're not just welcome here, you belong here. This is your community. And so what we want is for you to have a role in our next capital works program, for example. And we want to be getting as diverse views as we possibly can. So what does that new space look like for a new arrival to the area, whether they were born overseas or they're somebody who's moved from another state? What would it be like for a shift worker being able to access the kind of premises? What would it be like for grandparents who are caring for their children, or a person who has limited English proficiency? So because we're trying to name those experiences early, then the design changes, and it could just be as basic as hours of operation or clarifying the signage. We're wanting those spaces to become really flexible. Then we talk about dialogue before decisions are made. And I think that this is something, certainly with our crossing here, the decision has been made that the crossing will be removed. And this is meant to be the part of the time when we have decisions about, well, what's it actually going to look like? So it should be a listening first kind of activity where we go as workers into where people already are. And I would, of course, we want to have community consultations. We want to have maybe something every Thursday night at 6 p.m. at a certain place. But we also can be looking at things like school pickup places. What are parents doing and talking about when they're at the school gate? What about things like at sporting grounds and at markets, around a library? So again, where are people congregating, and how can you actually get in there to begin these intercultural dialogue conversations? The third is around local leadership, and it's really important. I'll talk a little bit later about community connectors, but they could be the youth coaches and settlement workers, or elders, faith leaders, artists. what we need to be doing is to provide them with opportunities to shape agendas and to give them a public recognition of the kind of leadership that they're responsible for in their communities. And one of the aspects of this that becomes really important is that we grow their capability to do more and more good work within their communities. Then we're talking about, as we know, long vision and local action. We often can't do this because of funding cycles of a project of 6 months or 3 years or whatever it is, changes in government funding guidelines. So really we want to be asking the questions of our community about, in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, what will belonging here feel like? And we can get a bit of a sense of whether or not there'll be gentrification in our community, for example. But we need to be really asking people 5 years ago, what do you want this community to be right now in 2025, almost 2026? And part of that could be creating habits around helping people to feel as though they're part of the community. And it could be as simple as an intercultural neighbourhood week, which is run by locals rather than by council. It might be a regular youth council every year that meets quarterly. There's a lot of different ways of being able to create these habits of inclusion and intercultural dialogue. And then the final one is around collaboration becoming a culture of your community. And often this is actually limited to the community services or community engagement section of council. Often people are, expected to be the ones who, community services, community engagement are the ones who are expected to do everything. We know that. But it in fact needs to be incorporating libraries, arts and culture. It needs to incorporate engineering, economic development, so that these conversations and partnerships become really important parts of the work that they do as well. We know that conversations feed better decisions, that better decisions reinforce belonging. Belonging then attracts community leaders and it sustains the long-term habits and visions of a community. Those habits make collaboration easier, and then all of that results in much greater social cohesion. I'll take you through 6 practical themes, and some or all of these are going to be relevant to your context. I'll go through these quite quickly because I would like to have some time at the end for questions. The first one is that decisions that are made now influence the future, and that every decision leaves a fingerprint, and that's for better or worse. Sometimes you don't want your fingerprints to be seen on something, other times you do. There was a council that I was working with a few years ago where we realised that feedback was coming from the same kind of 20 people every single time, and they were really well intentioned and they came to everything, but they didn't actually represent the diversity of the area. So the team changed how and who they asked for input, and then the process they used to ask for that. And instead of having another formal meeting at 6 o'clock on a weeknight, we popped up at local shopping centres and partnered with youth groups and translated a short survey into a number of different community languages. And one of the things that we didn't ask was, what's the opportunity, but how are these concerns experienced differently across our community? And what ended up happening was that we got the same 20 people, but we also got renters and young parents, migrants. We got small business owners, and those people hadn't engaged before with council. So it was actually really exciting. And what we wanted to do was to say to residents, you're part of the problem, whatever this problem is. We want to have conversations with you because we want you to be part of the solutions in this community. So the final plan ended up looking and sounding like the real community, and people did develop this sense of belonging, not just about, I live here, this is lovely, I say hello to people, but, oh yeah, what's around me that I should be being involved with? How can I have my say? What sort of things should I be saying? But I need to make sure that my voice matters. And as I said before, intercultural dialogue isn't just about culture or religion, but it's also about intersections. And we're not about collecting opinions, but about giving people the opportunity to have a say and work out what the solutions to the particular problems are. And if people don't see any results from the conversations or the suggestions, recommendations that they're putting forward, they're not going to keep participating. Places are really important. They certainly are to me. And every street or park bench or mural says something about who belongs in that community. There are many, many places that I go where I see the level of diversity in a particular suburb, and there's nothing there that reflects the people who are clearly in the majority in that particular area. So I think that's in itself is something that we need to be having a look at. Part of my job is looking around the room and thinking who's not there, but also it's about looking around and thinking, how do they see themselves and where do they see themselves in this community? And if you don't see yourself at all, but you're the majority, then how can you ever have a sense of belonging? Because no one tells you that it's okay for you to be here. We talked before about long-term planning, and that's really about looking at an overall intercultural goal. And one of the things about interculturalism is that its approaches actually favour the long game, that it's about building trust and systems that keep working every time a funding cycle ends. And that's, to me, one of the most important aspects of this. Collaboration across councils and groups and residents make sure that there are stronger futures in our communities, because again, it can't be up to council, it can't be up to service clubs, it can't be up to residents. They all have this shared responsibility, and they all need that responsibility to be able to be flexible. When times are getting tough, it could be a disaster, it could be some kind of populist, marches down the street, whatever it is that maybe is a threat to your community. And I've seen some really good examples of this happening over time, where communities have moved from this reactive problem response into an opportunity-driven response. Now, the final theme is around intercultural mindset. And this is kind of my favorite in a way, because it lets us be really creative. Intercultural mindset means that whatever it is that you want to do in a specific program doesn't have to cost you any money. It might cost you staff time, that kind of thing, but it doesn't have to. And so when you're putting on an activity, it could easily just be, and I always use the example of a festival, multicultural festival, where there's, not always a lot of interaction between people. You can see people dancing, but you don't necessarily know the stories behind the dancing, for example. So you could do something like running an intercultural dialogue session. So one of the things that we've been doing is a particular methodology called People Are Stories. And People Are Stories are about people bringing their whole selves, not just their particular experience, but their whole self, to talking with one or two other people. So what you end up getting is not just them talking as the owner of the story, but other people also talking about their particular experiences. And it's that intercultural dialogue that, again, will help communities to change the narrative at the local barbecue or the school gate, because all of a sudden there are more and more and more people who know each other, and we want people to know each other in their communities in order to have much greater social cohesion. So again, I'm going to ask just one question, 1 minute or a little bit less, which is around what of those 6 themes feels most relevant to you right now? So the 6 themes are intercultural mindset, collaboration across councils and other organisations, long-term planning, which outlasts quick fixes, creating places that people value and keeps people connected, making sure that local voices matter, and also decisions that are made now influence the future. Right. To put all of this into practice, I've created 3 different tools that you could use, and use them this afternoon or tomorrow. The first one is an intercultural checkpoint. So looking at something like, before you finalise any plan, even just to go out and talk to people, that you look at things like who benefits from this question or who doesn't benefit. Who do I need to make sure is in this room? How do I go about getting them in here? How do I, what do I need to do in order to get them, and where do they go to for information that I can make sure that I'm getting those information out through those channels? How can I let them know that it's not just about them being invited, but that we actually need them to be there to make sure that the decision that we're making is going to be the best decision? And then what does fairness look like for each of the affected groups? And again, that affected group might be positive. You know, how is this community centre going to be used by all of the different people that we talked about before? And then after the meeting or the consultation project that you're doing, did those people that you wanted to attend actually attend? And if they did, who else attended with them? If they didn't, who did attend? Why didn't they come? How did they find out or not find out about it? You can find that out during the consultation. Asking people who weren't there why they weren't, how you could get them there next time, and the kind of tweak that you would have been able to make that would have had a positive difference to the process and the outcomes that you used. And you can do that in 5 minutes pre and post consultation, and it will save you months and months of repair. And I know that you all know that, but sometimes it is about remembering those sorts of basics so that you're not just so busy that you keep kind of doing things without being able to sit back for a couple of minutes and just think about it. The next is a community connectors map, and many of you might know this as a social network map. It's things like who are the people who act as bridges in the community, local elders, sporting coaches, youth mentors. And I like to sit down and do a mind map of who are these connectors in our community. And because you don't just need them for that particular project, you need them on an ongoing basis. So you want to be holding, events for them after hours during the day, so that you're saying to them, you're really important to us. And they're not usually the loudest voices, but they're often the most trusted voices in a community. So reach out to them, reach in to them, and get them in really early so that you can be creating that kind of process with them. And then the last one is around story capture. So for me, it's been a really long time since I've heard about councils holding essay competitions for kids. I don't know about you, but they used to have that all the time where I was growing up, about what do you love about living in this area, drawing competitions about, what's your favorite place, or photography exhibitions, take some photos of our parks. So we don't do that kind of connection anymore, I think. And if we do, I certainly haven't heard about it for a very long time. You could also look at running a small process or a project on future stories where small groups are imagining a newspaper headline in 10 years' time. Our town leads in sustainability and community pride in this particular area. That could be something that you use as a headline, and people work backwards from that to work out what they would need to do in order to get there to do that. So to reduce barriers to these I was just going to say the tricky issues that we have, if there's a policy issue, then that policy needs to be changed. If it's a problem issue, then we need to be thinking more about it. And often that's also about kindness and making sure that we're including the right people. And then if it's a perception problem, then it needs clearer facts and more listening. But we do know that keeping communities talking generally isn't easy, and that it takes a skill set that not everyone has. And even if it's their job, because we often have really high expectations and a pressure to get it right. We don't want to be offending people because we ask them the wrong question. But what I've found over the years is that, again, if all of that's based on trust, there are no stupid questions. There are just respectful questions that help people to understand each other. And so those sensitive or emotionally charged topics, if they start from a basis of trust, are much more likely to, if they're not resolved, then at least to be able to help people to understand more about why people are so sensitive, or why it's so important to the community that people are yelling at each other, or whatever the incivility is. So I think one of the most important aspects to all of this is around bringing people together. Said that so many times, but I can't say it enough. And before I finish, I just want to give you an example of a playground upgrade that I was involved with many years ago when I worked in Logan City. It was a really small investment from council for the kind of bang for buck that it had in the long run. And it did not look like this. Unfortunately, it was a very mid 1990s playground, but we thought it was pretty gorgeous at the time. And on paper, it was straightforward when we're looking at, we've got some money to upgrade a playground. Where do we do that? So normally we'd look at what's the wear and tear data. How do we make sure that we're not just giving in to the loudest voices in the best resource suburbs? And, how do we apply budget constraints? And what happened was that one of the councillors actually said, which of the parts of our city feel the least seen by us? Which ones don't we see very often? And we were like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And that question changed everything. So we then went into an older, more disadvantaged, more diverse neighbourhood that didn't even have a playground. And because we would have overlooked it because it didn't have a playground, we're upgrading playgrounds. And we spent weeks walking through that area, talking with older people who'd been in the suburb for years to get a sense of what the suburb used to be like, what some of the cultural or environmental themes. And we sat there in, an existing park that was very poorly designed and quite dangerous. And we were talking with parents and children. And what we ended up being able to do was to get other people, other parts of council involved. And we got some money from them and also from Lions Club. The local neighbourhood house became involved and they were able to get funding for a community arts project. We were able to work with young people in particular who were engaging in some low-level crime and graffiti issues because they were really bored. And there was only one bus in that suburb out in the morning and one back in the afternoon. It was a very isolated community. It took us about 4 months, but we ended up with, people having this fantastic playground at the end of it. And we were able to get a whole lot of things happening one after the other. So while we were waiting for some funding for a community arts project, for example, the Lions Club came in and with local community helped to plant a garden along the edges of the pathway that the council had created. We wanted people to constantly see that there was momentum and to constantly be engaged. So we didn't have 4 or 5 month gaps in us then just going back and having these transactional kind of relationships. A couple of things came out of it that were really important and at the time we didn't expect. And again, this is kind of 30 years ago, but over time we of course expect all of this now. But because there was so much positive publicity in the local papers, other residents from other parts of that council area visited and they saw an area of cultural diversity that they wouldn't have probably seen before. Parents got to know each other and we were able to start things like free skills exchanges where people joined a local babysitting club that we started, for example. There were free cooking classes around nutrition, which was an issue at the time. People with cars were offering to drive others out of the suburb, give them a little bit of petrol money, but to drive them out to go to appointments outside of the suburb. We started running after school homework clubs around picnic tables in that park, and then we expanded those as more and more kids came along to neighbourhood houses and people came from everywhere as volunteers to help out. And then our organisational partnerships lasted for years and we were able to attract other resources to that suburb, but some of those partnerships or some of those organisations were also outside of that suburb. So we were able to join together to do projects in other areas. Now, there's a lot of stories for me about this, but my memory constantly is that councillor's question. And I'd never thought of it at the time, and I think of it all the time now, that this became much more of a playground simply because the question was asked, who are we not seeing? And I think that is, to me, just a genius question. So I'm going to finish up. I want to go back to the beginning for 1 second, which is that the future's local, that communities that don't talk together don't last together. And every community, every council, every organisation has a choice, and that its choices about operating in silos and keeping people separate from each other without always even understanding or realising it. But that if they want their social cohesion goals to grow, then it has to be through intercultural dialogue and connection. And it's the only thing that's actually going to be the antidote to communities where they're feeling fragmented, where local leadership is feeling as though it's frustrated, where people are feeling as though council or others are not working in their best interests. We need to remember that places and conversations and relationships are not going to be perfect, but what we're striving for all the time, because we can't change systems overnight, is about starting with one relationship and one conversation and then keeping that going, because the idea is about building trust over time, and for people to give each other a break and to forgive kind of unintentional faux pas that happen in a society when you're a little bit blundering your way through still, and being really upfront about that, saying we're not going to get it right all the time, we really want to, but we're not going to. So just to finish, I want to say thank you very much for coming along. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. I wanted this just to be within, this is our final presentation. It's only an hour. We could have talked about this all day, really, and given a lot more detail, but I do really thank you for coming along. For some people, it's your lunch hour, and I really do appreciate that. So thank you very much, Charles. And if anyone wants to have offline conversations, I'm happy to talk to you for longer. You can either get in touch through those details or through my LinkedIn. So thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Linda, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Wow. I've just been thinking I'm going to share that with every single politician, every single community group, every single person, because it's the challenge that we all face. How do we create these communities? And I know our good friend Peter Kenyon's all about these communities in rural areas. And I just think even in our metropolitan areas, just fantastic. Thank you. That ticked every box for me today. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions of Linda? We have her for another 8 minutes or so. If you'd like to ask a question, please unmute yourself. Andrew, I see that you've done that. I'm sure you've got a question for Linda. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for everybody for joining us today. And I hope that you will get a copy of this after the presentation. I hope you do share it widely, because I think this has been super, super informative today. Andrew, got a question for us?
Look, I actually have two, but I'll just leave with one to allow space for other questions. Linda, how do you navigate fear? And what I mean by that is, for example, fear from like a local government or a state government about like if we engage, we're going to get criticised, which I know is really valid, but also fear in communities. Like, if there's this kind of community kind of sphere, how do we know it's not going to be dominated by the loud voice who just goes on and is rude and all those kind of things, and fear in terms of like, how do I make sure that I'm not going to offend like these groups, these cultures that I don't know anything about?
Yep. I'd just say there's always a place to start. So part of that is about starting with this last question, part of it's about saying, look, I may well step on a whole lot of your beliefs, customs, but just tell me. I really need you to tell me. And I used to run a multicultural service, and before I went to any kind of event, I always asked one of my staff members who was from that culture, like, what shouldn't I do? And that to me really was the most important thing. And I found out with some communities, for example, do not sit on the table. You can't sit on the table while you're talking. I went, oh, okay, well, that's a really important thing to know. And so, it's sometimes those little nuances that you will never ever know unless you ask the person whose culture it is or whose faith it is. So part of it is about identifying people in your community that can be trusted as advisors to you, and who will tell you about that, but will also open up those social connections. And sometimes it might be, I don't know, the rabbi, or it could be the leader of the Peak African Association in the area, or it could be a woman who runs a neighborhood house. It just depends on where you need to start. And then again, because we're talking here about trust, using that, keeping in touch with that person, so it's not transactional. It is something that has an ongoing, an expectation of an ongoing relationship. So I think where you start is to say, we are going to do this, and we've got some issues down here in Victoria, certainly Greater Melbourne. There have been 4 conflicts recently that have been intercultural conflicts, and those councils really have gone out of their way where they didn't know people to go and find them, and also to make sure that their connections, once they find those people, are really strong. And one of them blew up internationally, actually, and the council, to begin with, were thinking, oh, do we have a background kind of conversation about this? And that's what they ended up doing to start with. And then they got in some partners, and then those partners, the funding partners, and now that's turned into a project. So again, from little things, big things grow. So I hope that's answered the question, Andrew. Great.
Andrew, fire away with your second one, please.
So I'm working with a regional town in South Australia at the moment, who are undertaking a community conversations phase, which at this point is purely just by survey. And like, the questions are good surveys. They're similar in questions are good questions. They're similar in some ways to what you are talking about, very aspirational based, like what's the future you want to see in this place? What are your hopes for your children? What's helped with that to date? What would help further? Those kind of things, like, all very well phrased, but they will soon come to a point, and they're well aware of this, they'll soon come to a point where, like, surveys will only engage so many people and a certain subset. And so they're starting to grapple with, how might you run groups or do workshops or whatever it might be, like precisely along the lines, I guess, of what you're suggesting. And I think there's a number of barriers in that. Partly it's like, what do we know? We don't know. We don't feel like we know how to do this stuff. So what kind of broad suggestions do you have around that?
In terms of running a workshop, you mean?
Yeah, the group work, like, to keep it really informal, really conversational, like not get experts in, not have it facilitated professionally, like to have it really community.
Really low, yeah. So so you want one of those sort of you want conversations rather than consultation.
Yeah.
And again, I keep talking about the first webinar of these that I went to, I think back in July, I think, Charles, something like that, where Peter Kenyon, who of course everyone's known for a very long time, changed my thinking after all of these years, where he said you only ever have tables of 4 people. That's it. So you want people to be able to see each other when they have those consultations. And I used to have the round table, 8 people, sticky notes, the whole deal. Paper or something like that is the best way to have the conversation. And to make it a really free range conversation, if people get cranky with each other, that's fine, because that at least there's going to be some opportunity for creating understanding within the room, because if it's not dealt with in the room, it's just going to go outside. And if it goes outside, then there's no opportunity for understanding and for people to listen to each other. So people get cranky, it's all right. We get cranky with each other all the time. It's all part of living together. So it doesn't have to be something that you're afraid of, but you set ground rules at the very beginning. You do all the time anyway. And whenever you have a consultation, we always set ground rules.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Linda. And Linda, back 4 or 5 slides, actually, you had those 5 key points. And one of those was about the community leadership being able to, allow people to engage, and having that person who may not necessarily see Andrew, as you were sort of alluding to, a professional facilitator, but someone in the community who has the diversity and connections across all of the community that may be soft enough but firm enough to be able to invite conversation. And I think Linda's points back in this presentation, which we'll share with you with this video after today, I think comes back to that point of how we get the community to actually talk. Yep. Linda, we don't have any other questions, but if anybody does want to throw one final curly.
Can I just add one thing, just from my knowledge and background?
Yes.
One of the things, Andrew, sometimes it works is basically who you are really talking with and talking to. It's basically sometimes people do get overwhelmed with big crowds of, where you're getting the views. So it's always really good to have a small group and made them sit in a semicircle. And that works. And and depends what kind of consultation it is happening, but general community members are normal people, they don't like all those protocol kind of effect and the suited booted people coming and taking the consultation. So it should be more humanly touched to talk. And yeah, so I'm sure with their expertise and everyone's expertise, people can get some answers. But some of the thing in some of the sessions that we have done, we might have to do few multiple sessions to get the feedback of a certain things, but it worked. Yeah, thank you. I just thought I'll just add that.
Thanks, Arthur.
Thank you, Arthur.
You're on mute, Charles.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and for over this series of webinars that we've had at Rebuilding Australia this year. We hope you've got something out of them. I know I do continually, and we have fantastic presenters. And Linda, thank you for sharing with us over the last 3 months your cultural understandings and advice as to how we can make our communities stronger through intercultural relationships. So it's been very informative and very much appreciated. So on behalf of everybody here and those who've attended, thank you, Linda, for being such a fantastic presenter and educator to all of us.
Been a pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Linda. It's been great. All right. Linda, do you have any final pearls of wisdom you'd like to share?
No, I don't, except go forth and make sure you're having conversations with people you wouldn't ordinarily talk to. So that's really fun. But thanks everyone. It's been fantastic to I can see there's a whole lot of people who've been to at least one of the others, and it's really been fantastic to have you contributing to this. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again. If we don't see you before Christmas, have a fantastic Christmas. Take all your learnings from this year and make 2026 an even greater year for your communities. So thank you very much and good afternoon.